Domestic violence is also linked with sexual abuse of animals, depending on the study, as high as 25% of survivors of domestic violence reported that as part of the cycle of violence there. We know that those that commit animal cruelty are 5 times more likely to commit violent crimes. And these actions against animals can be a mixture of that they're currently committing crimes, that they have a history of doing that, or it can be a future predictor or a mixture thereof. Right. It's so important that the FBI's BAU is tracking it and collecting data. With interpersonal violence, we also use domestic violence interchangeably. In the United States, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will experience that sometime in their lifetime. This also bears out in the world statistics through the World Health Organization. 1 in 3 women will experience it, domestic violence or sexual violence. Worldwide, 50% of female homicides committed by an intimate partner or family member. And this was also supported by a study in the United States looking at 47 major cities where almost half of those female homicides were also committed by intimate partners. So here's this connection with the animals. Depending on the study that's looked at, is anywhere from 75 to 88% reported where they had pets in domestic violence homes, that those animals will be threatened, injured, or killed. And when we talk about threatening, that's that emotional abuse or terrorizing the animal. Domestic violence victims are also 11 times more likely than non-victims to report their animals have been physically hurt or killed. And then the tie-in, and that one of the barriers for those living in domestic violence to leave is not having a place to take their pets. As high as 65%, again, depending on the study, have reported that they would delay or not leave at all if they didn't have a place to take their pet or take them with them. So that's a significant barrier and goes to that bond. So now, talking about veterinarians and their role in these cases, certainly in court, our job as veterinarians is to search for that truth and to speak to that. We can speak to that animal experience. It's important for us to be able to testify to that. We can explain the process of the illness, their injuries, and certainly what they're experiencing through the dying process. We can talk about pain and suffering, and also talking about what is normal, what would be expected, as well as what is abnormal. Looking at what could cause these injuries or findings, whether it's accidental versus non-accidental, meaning non-accidental means it required the actions or lack of actions on that behalf of a human. And then there's certain patterns of injury associated with trauma and certain causes that I'll speak more about, but that we can speak to. And this is why our expertise is needed. Now, as veterinary forensics, this is a fairly new field, but really it's applying our veterinary knowledge to legal cases, to answer legal questions. There's not necessarily education throughout the normal veterinary curriculum about animal cruelty, about abuse, or even the link. But this is growing more in the veterinary curriculum. So, but most of the education that veterinarians are getting is primarily postgraduate work, meaning conferences or taking online courses. There's publications that are more and more being published out there on studies or findings. We also have the human forensic sciences and those experts that they are becoming more involved with animal cases, and where their field can be applied to animal cases, though sometimes it's with limitations. It just depends on that area of science. So there's this blend between the veterinary world and the human forensic world where we're learning from each other. So the difference between veterinary medicine and human medicine, well, as veterinarians, the pathologists are not trained as medical examiners, and that can present some issues where in testimony, they are trained to report back to the veterinarian that submitted the body or submitted the tissue samples. They are not used to doing a full report and determining such as cause of death or cause of injury. So that's a difference in that there are some pathologists that have done additional training or are willing to do that kind of work and testify to that, but normally those reports are being generated for the veterinarian to interpret that. There's also the variety of species. We have everything under the sun that we are trained on throughout our veterinary education. And then when we graduate, we tend to focus on certain species. There are still some veterinarians that can do a variety of species in their work, but we have zoo veterinarians, we have reptile veterinarians, we have aquatic or fish veterinarians. So there's this huge variety that we have to learn about. Because of those different species that we deal with, we also see the difference on how they respond to injury, how they respond physically to illness, and their emotional needs, their emotional well-being, their welfare is going to vary based on that species. Also, based on that animal, the individual animal, as well as the species, we can see difference in behavior and how they respond to different environments or to fear or to distress. So that brings me to, do animals suffer, right? In 2012, so a decade ago, there was a group of neuroscientists that came together with this Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, where they confirmed that many animals, including all mammals and birds, as well as other species, possess the neurologic substrate that generates consciousness. And that is needed to show that they have this consciousness, because sentience, which is another way we're referring to animals, is that ability to perceive and feel things, where an animal can demonstrate preferences, desires, or wants, and will show that they avoid suffering and seek positive experiences, including socializing with other species, their own species, and with humans. So what we can see, because in animals, is that they have emotional and physical suffering. And there's more published research. There's actually a new edition coming out on this, but there's tons of work in the animal welfare world showing the scientific basis that animals can suffer not only physically, but also emotionally or psychologically. So what is that experience in pain and suffering? Well, this is where the veterinarian's critical to speak to that experience that the animal went through or is currently going through. We know in veterinary medicine that animals can experience pain. They require anesthesia for procedures. They require sedation or pain medication for procedures or injury. And what does it look like? Well, it's going to look different in a turtle versus a puppy versus a horse versus a cow. So being able to interpret that. The other thing that's come out is facial expressions, that there is a pain scale, and this is from the Global Pain Council. There's pain scales that we can see. It's been done in mice. There's something in horses, I think, that just came out with cats, with dogs, that we can look at their face and assess their pain based on those expressions, what they're doing. The animal may not vocalize at all when they're painful or they're fearful. So that's an individualization of that animal. Another thing to note is animals do not show injury like humans. They don't necessarily show surface bruising or visible injury. They're made to survive outside. So they don't have the same capillary bed that we do in our skin. So when we do see surface bruising or visible bruising on an animal, that does tell us we have significant hemorrhage. Right. And as I mentioned, we have mental and emotional suffering of the animals, and how they adjust to that is different for each one. So the behavior of animals comes into play, and there's more and more studies going on in response to and looking at cruelty cases, but it's really variable based on the species, what's present, other animals being around, the humans that are around. So it can be very difficult to assess. But basically, animals thrive whenever all their needs are being met. Their physical, mental, and emotional needs. The socialization is another critical one. The environment impact on their behavior. They want to be in a safe environment. They need shelter. They need sustenance. They need access to all those things. They need the ability to express normal behavior and to rest. right? So the denial of any of those things can affect the animal's behavior. The presence of other animals, social interaction is important, but that can affect their behavior. You can have dominant animals having sick, suffering, or dying animals around other animals. Definitely has an impact. There's a reason that in our euthanasia protocols that we are to not euthanize an animal in front of another animal because of that impact. So you can see a wide range of behavior related to anxiety, fear, aggression. The animal can act out, being destructive. They can shut down. And then there's something called learned helplessness, where the animal just gives up on trying to affect change on an environment that they are suffering in, right? And this is critical to note, that even in an abusive situation, and especially with pets, that they will continue to seek positive interaction even from the abuser, right? So as I said, we can see animals just present for behavior problems, especially related to new people, as an indicator that the animal is being abused, or extreme fear reactions, inappropriate eliminations, inappropriate responses to their environment at all. Something's changed, and they've been severely stressed. Indicators for us can be extreme reactions or guarding of specific regions of the body that's unusual, things that they're demonstrating related to people, items, sounds, or smells, and then any behavioral indicators of pain. Sometimes that's licking at an area. All right. With interpersonal violence in animals, they're living in unpredictable environments. There's emotional and physical abuse. We may see financial, the exertion of financial control, where they prevent or delay medical care for the animal. A common thing that we see is someone new coming into a relationship, and then they systematically kill off the pets with accidental explanations being given. And there's multiple types of abuse. It's chronic. But there's also injury patterns we now know that are different than what we would normally see in accidental causes of injury to animals. And this is from several papers that have been published about what is the person doing in a domestic violence situation. What are they doing to the animals? And the most common thing they're doing is slamming them or throwing them against the wall. And then there's other forms of blunt force trauma, kicking and hitting them in a variety of ways. They may deprive them of food or water, or leave them outside in inclement conditions, abandoning them, refusing medical care, intentionally giving them drugs or alcohol, drowning, burning them. Suspending them is common, even if it's temporary, by their legs, their tail, or by their throat. They're choking them. And then, as I mentioned before, sexual abuse of the animal. So Dr. Reisman from the ASPCA Berg Memorial Hospital in New York City, his unit is responsible for seeing all the cruelty cases of all the boroughs of New York. And so he is looked at a retrospective study looking at cases of cruelty that were also related to interpersonal violence. And I talked to him recently, and the same pattern is still bearing out. But it only accounts for 8% of all the cruelty cases they see is domestic violence related, but they had a higher mortality, 33% versus all other cruelty at 10%. Most of the mortality was smaller animals. So about half were cats or dogs less than 15 pounds. Of those 79 animals, 51 had blunt force trauma, where they were thrown, or blunt force trauma was found on exam, stomped, kicked, or hit. 18% were neglect, and 13% was a variety of other types of cruelty, including gunshot, stabbings, burnings, and drowning. Only 5% of the cases was no injury found. But this is what was interesting. 15 of the animals had multiple bone fractures. 13 of those were deceased, and 13 of those was a witnessed event. And in 11 of those, the animal was thrown, so slammed or thrown into the ground. And the fracture pattern that he's found is that it's head, legs, and ribs. So it's the skull, mandible, teeth were most common, and a leg. So femur was the most common, but also tibia, and then ribs. And rib fractures are actually uncommon. I'll talk about that more. And they were one-sided, both-sided. And on one, there was a pelvic fracture, which we rarely see in animals unless a hit by car situation. So head, legs, and ribs seems to be this pattern of trauma in animals that have been abused in a domestic violence situation. Now, I mentioned in blunt force in animals that visible bruising less common. When we see it, tremendous amount of hemorrhage under the skin has occurred to the deeper tissue. There has to have been enough time for it to show up. In most of the injury is in that underlying tissue. And so thermal imaging may be used. You may see that in court. We're using forward-looking infrared technology. Lab tests looking at a muscle enzyme called CK or CPK can be high, indicating trauma. We may not see evidence of pain. Oftentimes the evidence may be just inside the eyes and inside the ears, because of a blow to the head can cause deeper hemorrhage in those areas or evidence of injury. Behavior that we can see is just the animal changes. They're sleeping more. They're not wanting to play. They may not want to eat. They may be lame for a short period of time and then that resolves. But we also have these known accidental patterns of injury, the most common being motor vehicle accidents or impacts. This is just some images with using forward-looking infrared thermal imaging, where the white is the hottest area. So we got a swollen testicle. The white around this eye is from blunt force trauma to that region. So you may see that. And this was a study looking at motor vehicle accidents versus non-accidental injury, and that was defined as cases that have been charged with animal cruelty. And the pattern that they found was that with motor vehicle accidents, pelvic fractures, that's the yellow arrows, it's sacroiliac luxation, so abrasions, degloving, injuries around that pelvis, so where the skin's been pulled away from flying across the pavement, and then a popping of the chest where you can see pneumothorax, so air in the chest or bruising in the lungs or pulmonary contusions. Versus cruelty cases, we saw skull fractures, teeth fractures, spinal fractures, rib fractures, and scleral hemorrhage. And they looked at this odds ratio in favor of cruelty. And one of the key indicators, and this bears out also with child abuse, is the presence of older healing fractures or healed fractures was 120 to 1 when that is present, that animal's been abused. They also looked at rib fracture patterns because ribs are really hard to break in animals. They're very flexible, primarily talking about dogs and cats, and the younger they are, the more flexible they are. And when we're talking about hit by cars or motor vehicle accidents, 92% were on one side because they believe that it's a decreased driver reaction time when the animal's crossing the road. It's primarily on the left, whereas oncoming traffic sees the animal and slows down. But if they were present, again, it was only 8%. It's anywhere from 3 to 8% that we see this related to hit by cars, but it's the more rigid area of the chest. So the more forward ribs are more fixed, and so they're more susceptible to fracture, whereas you move backwards, they're more flexible. And then they tended to be on one side, whereas in cruelty, there was no pattern. There's one side, both sides. So that's one of the things we look at is rib fracture patterns. One thing you're going to see in court is talking about body condition scales or body condition scoring. And this is used to assess the overall health of the animal, their nutritional status. How are they doing? This is something that is taught in every veterinary school. There's different scales for different species, but it's an objective scoring of that animal. So we use that. And then to go from an ideal body condition score in adult dogs and cats to emaciated, it takes, without any food, them eating anything, it takes approximately 4 weeks, right? But most of our cases, they have intermittent access to food, so it can be longer. But those with higher needs, such as juvenile animals, they're going to get skinnier faster, right? Because their metabolic rate has different needs. So this is just an example of the Purina scale that we use, which is a 1 to 9 scale for dogs and cats, noting when they're the different parameters that we're looking at. And you may see in court that someone says that they're a 3 or they're between a 3 and 4. So they may do a somewhat of a range, which is acceptable. Now, the starvation state in animals can result from a lot of different things, from food deprivation, so not being given food or not having access to it, It's poor quality, it may not be good, it's inappropriate, it's hard food and they have bad teeth, so they can't eat it. Or they could be sick. So we have to look at that. Pain and stress and illness will make an animal not want to eat, and certainly teeth issues will compromise that. But starving is a process of self-digestion, and animals use, just like with humans, external fat, then internal fat, then deep organ fat around the kidneys, the heart, and then last they utilize is the bone marrow fat. So that's where we can target testing, is a bone marrow fat percentage on deceased animals. And that can tell us if they were in an end-stage starvation state, which may or may not be due to other medical issues. It has to be analyzed in context. Now, the impact on animals with starvation, it causes pain. It may be intermittent pain, but there is pain associated with that process of starvation. It can impact their joints, their ability to walk. They're losing fat and muscle. It also is impacting their organs, their heart, their kidney, their gastrointestinal tract. There can be behavior witnessed or expected. They may vocalize for a while, wanting food, crying, mobility changes. They're looking for food. They may ingest non-nutrition items like rocks and sticks that may be found. And then, of course, there's a psychological impact where they cannot get their own food. Now, the abandonment comes up where animals are being abandoned or confined. That you can see evidence that they were seeking food, seeking water. They may destroy property, chew up things. You may see paw prints in the bathtub or the sink or around the toilet. They know where water and food sources were before they were abandoned. There's now, if you open up a door or window, especially in cats, they're not going to go out and start hunting and feeding themselves. There's fear of going outside. They've relied on humans. They have a rehoming instinct. They don't want to leave their home. So that is not acceptable to do. They often choose dark and closed spaces to die in these cases. Our cause of death, postmortem, testing and exam is often inconclusive, but based on the information from the case, based on that we assume they have or know they had food and water, and when they all run out, they're going to die from dehydration before they die from starvation. And time of death in animals is got the similar limitations as it is in humans. It's going to be based on the species and the information that we have available. There have been publications and research has been done on this. A lot of it comes down to the veterinarian's experience in their area and with those types of animals, where we know the stiffening and the cooling of the body after death is variable, but there is some parameters that we can use. Gastric emptying time, we do not use in animals typically. Vitreous potassium that they use in humans, that has been studied in dogs and found to be rises at the same level as it does in humans. But we primarily use insect evidence to get our timelines. That is the primary one if it's available. Lastly, the additional use of veterinary forensics that you can see is time of injury. We can look at wound healing. There's all sorts of research more being done on RNA and different, chemical analysis about timing of injuries based on our veterinary knowledge for that species. We know we can give a time estimate for that. DNA is being used. Databases have been established. It's been accepted in court. It's statistically been corroborated, and there's labs available. We can see species identification using fur, hair, and feathers, especially in the wildlife side. Bite marks have been used on animal attacks. There is limitations. It just depends on the situation. And then bloodstain pattern analysis, which again, we're using the bloodstain pattern experts, but they don't know how animals bleed, if they bleed from that area, or the expected animal behavior. So it requires working with a veterinarian in that bloodstain pattern to completely analyze bloodstains. And with that, that's the end of mine. I'm going to turn it over to Diane.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's really wonderful to be here and to share all this knowledge with you. And great thanks to Melinda Merck, who's like a leader in veterinary forensics. So I'm going to transition now to how can we use this veterinary information and evidence in court to assist judges and other people in understanding what happened to an animal and what might have transpired. So we're going to talk about protecting pets and humans. And of course, I had to pause for a moment to let my dog outside because he's like a child when the mom gets on the phone. When we talk about the link, we know that when animals are abused, people are at risk, and that when people are abused, animals are at risk. This is not a situation where these incidents occur in isolation. I see the link as threefold. Number one, the link between cruelty to animals and violence towards humans. And two, the link between a human and an animal. We often refer to this as the human-animal bond. And that's what makes these cases so emotionally draining and compelling, is often an animal is harmed in order to seek some power, control, or revenge against another human. And number three, the link among all the agencies and individuals concerned about the safety of the community. This is a matter of public safety, human welfare, and animal welfare. To memorialize the significance of this, the National Council for Juvenile and Family Court Judges adopted a resolution regarding animal cruelty, recognizing this link and how important it is for judges to be aware of this link and to help protect families as well as the pets within them. It is available at the link provided both in this presentation and in the handout we provided. What might occur in abusive households? What should judges be on the lookout for? Number one, having an attachment to a pet can be a buffering and protective factor for children in a home where abuse or neglect occurs. This also, they become a buffering and protective factor for other adults that might be the victims of interpersonal violence. And Melinda alluded to this concept of learned helplessness. We see that in human victims too. They finally give in. The very same attachment to an animal might be used by an abuser to intimidate and control a child or an adult. If you don't do XYZ, I will hurt Fluffy. Children might interfere to protect their companion animals from harm by adults, which means they are putting themselves in harm's way. And the biggest red flag is that animal cruelty can indicate that others in the home aren't safe, including children or other adults. What about children that abuse animals? What could cause this to happen, particularly those of you in the juvenile and family court scenario? Abuse of an animal by a child or a juvenile can be a sign that the individual has been or is experiencing physical abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect. Once again, there's this pecking order battering in some instances where mom or dad, the parent, harms the child who harms the pet. And it's this trickle down effect because that's what they've learned. They've become desensitized to violence in the household. And we've also know that witnessing animal abuse is traumatizing to children and can desensitize them to violence. We have a host of cases where there's traumatic impact on the adult or the child for having merely witnessed abuse. As a matter of fact, let me go to the previous one. When I was a prosecutor, by the way, I was a prosecutor in Denver for 32 years, and I appeared in every system, and at one point was the head of our juvenile court division. We do know that, for example, in a case of domestic violence, if a pet is harmed in the presence of a child, I will also charge child abuse, because we know that that child merely witnessing the crime or witnessing abuse of the other parent warrants a separate charge so that the perpetrator can be held accountable and recognize the negative effect this can have. Margaret Mead, anthropologist, said in 1964, one of the most dangerous things that can happen to a child is to kill or torture an animal and get away with it. And truer words were never spoken. And we are learning, as we treat this issue more seriously, that the days of boys will be boys, or it's just a dog or just a cat, are over, particularly when you're looking at this from the bench. This is a shocking statistic, but the median age for the onset of hurting animals is 6.5 years old, earlier than bullying, vandalism, and setting fires. So it might be one of the earliest markers that something is wrong in that household, or that that child needs some type of intervention. What can judges do to safeguard family members and the pets they're attached to? And I want to give a shout out to Judge Romero, who's also in attendance. We did a similar presentation early on for judges. One thing you do have to understand is, how is animal defined in your state? I'm from the state of Colorado, and every single one of these animals in this slide qualify as the subject for animal cruelty or animal neglect, because they all are living dumb creatures. And I have filed charges where there's been harm or abuse to a snake, to a squirrel, to a cat, to a dog, to a horse, to a cow, to a fish. And many of the cases I saw with juvenile perpetrators involved wildlife, either just gratuitous killing and firing BB rifles at squirrels, to harming snakes, and to doing harm to other animals that they have easy access to. The National Council has put out a wonderful technical assistance bulletin on their website about animal cruelty issues and what juvenile and family court judges need to know. You can download this assistance bulletin in its entirety from the website. Judges should ask, are there pets in the household? Does the child or do the children have an attachment to the pet? What's the condition of the pet's welfare and care? Is it likely that the child has witnessed ill treatment or neglect of the pet? If an animal's been injured or neglected, should a veterinary assessment be obtained? Should you ask a veterinary professional to assist the court in determining what likely occurred? So we're going back to the assistance. Forensic veterinarians like Dr. Merck can provide for the court in terms of expertise. On many occasions, having a veterinarian as an expert in an animal cruelty case is a loose equivalent to having a pediatrician talk to you about what might have happened to a child in a child abuse case. And I think one of the areas we learned this very acutely was shaken baby syndrome, where we learned about petechial hemorrhaging in children's eyes as a result of being shaken that we didn't know in those early cases. And as Dr. Merck alluded to, many injuries are hidden in pets, or diseases, or ill treatment, and we need the veterinarian to assist the court in rendering a better opinion. And I'm going to talk a minute about protective orders and custody. If the child stays in the home, what's the safety plan for the child and the pet? What about other at-risk adults and elders? If the child's removed, what's the care plan for the pet? Can there be visitation? Now, the one caveat to this is, what do you do if the child is the perpetrator of the harm? We have to take care to make sure that we don't put any living creature in harm's way. The most common experts in crimes against animals are going to be law enforcement, veterinarians, and animal control officers. Veterinarians as experts can assist the court on a host of levels and lend meaning to photographs or evidence. And some of the testing they do will yield like x-rays and blood test results and so forth. And as all the judges know, the basic standards under the rules of evidence are, is the area reliable, is the expert qualified, and is it relevant? And you will find that just by their very nature, veterinarians are experts. They have advanced degrees and advanced training and advanced experience in a special set of patients that they see and victims that they see. When Dr. Merck talked about the fact that there are a host of species, I never even thought about this, but when we're talking about human beings being harmed or injured or killed, they're just one species. Human beings are one species. So veterinarians may be dealing with dozens, and some may have extra competence in extraordinary species. And certainly they're going to be qualified by their degree, and probably further qualified by experience they have. And often this is going to be relevant. And one of the areas where we are seeing evolving expertise is in the area of a veterinarian being able to tell the judge or jury whether an animal is experiencing pain or suffering by certain objective standards. There are many states where it is mandatory for a veterinarian to report animal cruelty. Colorado, I'm proud to say, was the 6th state or 7th state in the union, and we enacted it in 2007. The American Veterinary Medical Association has an accessible graph, and you can click on your state to determine whether or not your state has mandatory reporting by veterinarians. So the veterinary community is absolutely realizing that they play an integral and essential role in dealing with animal crimes. There are several other types of experts in animal crimes. There are vet techs and technologists, animal behaviorists. Behaviorists can help us understand, why is an animal aggressive? You might see dog bite cases. And just as an aside, I know there was a study done many years ago, I believe it was by Dr. Randy Lockwood, that in terms of the statistics of dogs that bite, there's a significantly higher percentage of dog bites in homes where domestic violence occurs. You might need breeders, farriers, the people that help change the horseshoes on horses, wildlife or exotics experts, blood sport experts for animal fighting, forensic anthropologists, odontologists, and then the traditional crime scene experts, which Dr. Merck said they are recognizing the importance of their role in these cases and how animal evidence can help in human crimes. In a cruelty case, the veterinarian helps us in our efforts dedicated to exonerate the innocents. Whenever I lecture veterinarians, I say, you have this special skill set, and we all have to work harder to make sure that we exonerate the innocent, because there may be situations where something is accidental, or it's a predator, or it's a congenital health problem. Animal CSI. They can educate the jury about the animal, the species, the breed, the gender, the age, describe disease, injury, pain, suffering, educate the jury about the scene, about the food, the water, the shelter, sanitation, the quality of the air, and analyze evidence that connect the animal to the scene, the witnesses, or the suspect. They can determine causation. They can complete the picture where there's no animal or no weapon. Many animals are told cremated, or they run away, or they're thrown away. And what happens if the weapon can't be found? What about complicated causes of death or injury, or unusual species like reptiles? Dr. Merck helped on this case. We had a case where this is where the victim animal lived, and the allegation was that the dog squoze through this little part in the fence, went to the neighbor's yard, and the neighbor, when the dog came through, the neighbor went inside, got his gun, came back out and shot the dog, he claimed, in self-defense. The whole story was kind of made up to really explain why he shot the dog, and the forensic evidence was able to show us that the dog was shot from behind, entered behind its shoulder, and exited out the chest, showing the dog was retreating rather than advancing. Here's another case I had where there was no animal. A rabbit was sprayed with pepper spray out in a field, and the rabbit ran away. But we had the exact pepper spray. We had 5 eyewitnesses. We knew what species was indigenous to that area, and we were able to file charges because a veterinarian was able to render an expert opinion about the effect of this spray, whether or not it got in the rabbit's eyes, whether it licked it off, or whether it just got on its skin or it inhaled it. There will be medical evidence you'll see introduced at a trial that helps the fact finder determine the facts. And honestly, this animal CSI is really interesting, and a lot of it is cutting edge. A view from the bench. I did a bunch of family pictures, and of course I had to put in a whole family of huskies because I own a Siberian husky. One new area that's evolving is this no-hit zone. And I'm going to talk to you just momentarily about the National Link Coalition. I know the director for that is on this webinar, Phil Arco. He's a wonderful resource, and that's a wonderful website if you want to know more about the link. But one area we are exploring is addressing just hitting, what a danger it is to children in terms of physical and emotional abuse. So there's this new area about no hitting, end hitting. And the National Link Coalition put out a sticker and a flyer saying, this facility is a hit-free zone. We've also talked to individuals that are considering putting signs like this and posters in courtrooms saying grown-ups don't hit grown-ups, grown-ups don't hit kids, kids don't hit grown-ups, kids don't hit kids, and no one hits animals. So it's just kind of something to keep in the back of your mind as an evolving trend in addressing violence. And how does your state define domestic violence? We are really lucky. Colorado is a trendsetter, and our legal definition of domestic violence also includes any other crime against a person, against property, including an animal, when used as a method of coercion, control, punishment, intimidation, revenge, etc. So the fact that it is included within our legal definition of domestic violence kicks in all sorts of protocols and all sorts of actions and reactions. So I'm always going to be happy to help any of you that want to update your statutes. We can assist with that, as can my other colleagues at Animal Legal Defense Fund. We enacted this law many years ago that in criminal cases, in domestic violence cases, the court can enter a protection order prohibiting the taking, transferring, concealing, harming, disposing of, or threatening to harm an animal owned, possessed, leased, kept, or held by an alleged victim or witness. And note this, we can protect pets of witnesses. So it goes beyond victims and transitions and transcends to witnesses. And just because this is in the criminal protection order doesn't mean that you in states that don't have this specific provision couldn't enter a protection order protecting a pet with all this criteria because of the discretion you have when issuing a protection order or a restraining order. We also have civil protection orders, which mimics the language in the criminal protection order. You can't molest, injure, kill, take, transfer, encumber, dispose of, threaten harm. You can't threaten harm to an animal owned, possessed, leased, kept, or held by any other party or a minor child of either party. So we recognize the importance of protecting the bond a child has with its pet. And it goes further to say that the court can specify arrangements for possession and care of the animal. So when we talked about, and there's a whole other side of pet custody, but it's really interesting to note that judges have the ability to make the best provisions for the pet in the households that's in the interests of the humans and the pets. And some states have safe havens, and we can even put pets in on a witness protection and put them at a shelter under an alias if need be. There are a number of psychological assessment instruments and tools for the treatment of animals. And I know this is particularly important to judges to know what's available out there if I do have an animal abuser, whether it's an adult or a child. And this is a list of these instruments and tools. They are also accessible on the Colorado Link Project website. That's another great website aside and in addition to the National Link Coalition, with further explanation of these treatments and tools. It's also helpful to know that what kinds of crimes should alert the judge that the alleged perpetrator constitutes a greater risk to the community than other forms and types of abuse. At the top of the list, we see bestiality, child abuse, interpersonal violence, psychopathy, ritual abusers, sadistic torturers. So we see this level. The higher it is, the greater the risk. So you see the lower risk. So your intervention is going to vary determined in part by the nature of the crime and the background of the alleged offender. So these are great. This is also available on the Colorado Link Project website. They also have this scale that talks about the level of intervention and the level of harm, and once again, helps the court to assess the risk level. And one of the interesting things is the degree of intent and culpability. Obviously, the more accidental, the least serious, but the more intentional and deliberate and premeditated, the more the court has to have serious intervention. Our goal now is to educate and advise and intervene at the earliest possible sign that there might be any harm to animal. Get children while they are young. The youngest documented case I've seen, it was a publication written for a psychologist, and it was called Violence of the Lambs, of a 2-year-old intentionally harming his hamster, but they were able to intervene early. Off the bench, promote collaboration among all the agencies and professionals, cross-disciplinary training and cross-reporting, and assist in educating the community about the significance of this link. In Colorado, veterinarians have to report child abuse, and in Colorado, veterinarians have to report animal cruelty. Here's some additional resources and tools if you want to look into this link and acquire more tools for your work on and off the bench. And I highly recommend downloading the technical assistance bulletin from the National Council. And we will close with this lovely little video of this corgi. And Dr. Merkin, I thank you very much. I'm going to put up the next slide with our contact information, and we are happy to assist you in any way we can.
Thank you so much to both of our presenters, Diane Bulkin and Dr. Melinda Merck, for joining us today for this webinar and providing us with this wonderful information. We do have a few minutes left. If anyone who is participating would like to chat in a question, please feel free. We are taking a look at the chat right now, and we're happy to relay those questions. In addition, this is one of a series of webinars that the FCJ is hosting in our partnership with ALDF. And we should be providing you with follow-up information and flyers about our next webinars in the series, which are currently scheduled to happen after the holidays in January and February.